Good day, everyone. Together with Jolina Albaniel and Emeline Labrador, my name is Rachel Romero. We are House I, and we will be discussing Chapter 26, Rational Expectations Redux, Monetary Policy Implications. Here are our chapter objectives. By the end of this chapter, students should be able to describe how the new classical macroeconomic model differs from the standard pre-Lucas ASAD model. Number 2, explain what the new classical macroeconomic model suggests regarding the efficacy of activist monetary policy. Number 3, explain how the new Keynesian model differs from the new classical macroeconomic model. And number 4, assess the extent to which policymakers can improve short-run macroeconomic performance. The first topic in Chapter 26 is rational expectations, and the learning objectives are: number 1, how does the new classical macroeconomic model differ from the standard pre-Lucas ASAD model? Number 2, what does the new classical macroeconomic model suggest regarding the efficacy of activist monetary policy, and why? Rational expectation is an economic theory that postulates that market participants forecast economic outcomes based on the best information available to them. Although individual forecasts can be very wide of the mark, aggregate predictions are not predictable. The theory of rational expectations was first proposed by John F. Muth of Indiana University in the early 1960s. He used the term to describe the many economic situations in which the outcome depends partly on what people expect to happen. For example, a commodity's price is determined by how many acres farmers plant, which is determined by the price farmers expect to receive when they harvest and sell their crops. The concept of rational expectations assert that outcomes do not differ systematically, regularly, or predictably from what people expected them to be. The rational expectations doctrine is motivated by the same reasoning that led Abraham Lincoln to assert you can fool some of the people all of the time and all of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. It does not deny that people frequently make forecasting errors, but it does imply that errors will not occur consistently on one side or the other. The theory of rational expectations has important implications for monetary policy because expansionary monetary policies cannot be effective if economic agents expect them to be implemented. As discovered in the 1970s by Len Merman, Robert Lucas, Thomas Sargent, Benit McCallum, Edward Prescott, and other economists of the so-called expectations revolution. The concept of rational expectations undermines the idea that policymakers can manipulate the economy by systematically instilling false expectations in the public. Robert Lucas demonstrated that if expectations are rational, the government cannot manipulate forecast errors in the predictable and reliable manner because rational forecast errors are inherently unpredictable. Let us pause and reflect on the Continental Congress announcement during the American Revolution that it would cease printing bills of credit, the primary form of money in the economy since 1775 to 1776, when rebel governments began financing their little revolution by printing money. Because the Continental Congress made no other policy changes, everyone assumed that the country's large budget deficit would continue. Prices continued to rise. Why? Because its announcement did nothing to address its large and chronic budget deficit. The Continental Congress did not make a credible commitment to end inflation. It also did nothing to stop states from issuing additional bills of credit. Lucas was among the first to emphasize the significance of public expectations in macroeconomic forecasting and policy formulation. What was important, he argued, was not that policymakers' models predicted, but what economic agents, which is the people, firms, and governments, believe would happen. Because Keynesian cross diagrams and the ISLM and ASAD models did not explicitly account for rational expectations, Lucas, Sargent, and others had to recast them in what is known as the new classical macroeconomic model. The new model employs the AS, ASL, and AD curves but reduces aggregate demand shocks in the short run to zero if the policy is expected. Now consider this. If the expansionary monetary policy is not as expansionary as expected, output can actually decrease. If economic actors anticipate a large shift in AD, the AS curve will shift sharply left to maintain output at Y sub NRL as shown in figure 26.1, which illustrate the effect of an unexpected weak expansionary monetary policy. The Tupper Tantrum of May 21, 2013 demonstrated how vulnerable markets are to expectations. That day, the Fed simply stated that it would gradually reduce its $85 billion monthly bond buying program. The unexpected policy announcement caught market participants off guard, sending asset prices and currencies plunging around the world. 4 years later, the ECB attempted to avoid a repeat by leaking to the financial press that it was considering how to tell investors that it was considering slowing its own bond purchasing program, which was running at around 60 billion euro per month, in an effort to soften investors' expectations about how long the quantitative easing program would last. Finally, here are our key takeaways. Stabilization is also difficult because policymakers cannot know with certainty what the public's expectations are at every given moment. The good news is that the model suggests that inflation can be ended immediately without putting the economy into recession if policymakers can credibly commit to squelching it. That is because workers and others will stop pushing the AS curve to the left as soon as they believe that prices will stay put. The new classical macroeconomic model takes the theory of rational expectations into account, essentially driving the short run to zero when economic actors successfully predict policy implementation. And then, the new classical macroeconomic model draws the efficacy of expansionary monetary policy or expansionary fiscal policy or EFP into serious doubt because if market participants anticipate it, the AS curve will immediately shift left, keeping output at YZ but moving prices significantly higher.
The new Keynesians. So the learning objectives is how does the new Keynesian model differ from the new classical macroeconomic model? So the new classical model macroeconomic model aids the cause of non-activist economists who believe that policymakers should have little discretion as possible because it suggests that policymakers are more likely to make things, especially in price level and the aggregate output, worse rather than better. Next is the activists could not stand idly by, but neither could they ignore the implications of Lucas' critique of preparational expectations, macroeconomic theories. So the result was renewed research that led to the development of what is often called the new Keynesian model. That model directly refutes the notion that wages and prices respond immediately and fully to expected changes in price level. So workers in the first year of 3-year labor contract, for example, can push their wages higher no matter their expectations. So firms are also reluctant to lower wages even when unemployment is high because doing so may exacerbate the principal agent problem in the form of labor strife, everything from slacking to theft to strikes. So new hires might be brought in at lower wages, but but if turnover is low, that process could take years to play out. And similarly, companies often sign multi-year fixed price contracts with their with their suppliers and or distributors. Effectively, they're preventing them from acting on new expectations of price level. In short, wages and prices are sticky and hence adjustments are slow, not instantaneous as assumed by Lucas and company. So if that's the case, as figure 26.2, effect on EMP and the nucleation model shows anticipated policy can and does affect the aggregate output, although not as much as an anticipated policy move to the same type, timing, and magnitude would. So the takeaway is that an EMP, is even if it is anticipated, can have positive economic effects, but it is better if the central bank initiates anticipated policies, and there is still a chance that policies will backfire if wages and prices are not as sticky as people believe, or if expectations and actual policy implementation differ greatly. So this is the effect of an EMP and the nucleation model. So the key takeaways is the nucleation model leaves more room for discretionary monetary policy. Like the new classical macroeconomic model, it is post-Lucas and hence relays that expectations are important to policy outcomes. Unlike the new classical macroeconomic model, however, it poses significant wage and price stickiness and completely regardless of the expectation of economic actors. EMP can therefore increase in aggregate output over the YNARL, although less than if the policy were anticipated. Although, of course, at the cost of higher price level, the long-term analysis of the ASD ASAD model still holds. Similarly, to the extent that wages and prices are sticky, some stabilization is possible because policymakers can count on some output response to their policies. The new Keynesian model is more pessimistic about curbing inflation. However, because the stickiness of the ES curve prevents price and wages from completely and instantaneously adjusting to credible commitment. The last one is the output losses, however, will be smaller than an anticipated move to squash inflation, and some economists think it is possible to minimize the output losses further by essentially reducing the stickiness of the AS by incredibly committing to slowly reducing inflation.
26.3 Inflation Busting. Learning objective. Can policymakers improve short-run macroeconomic performance? If so, how? Fighting inflation requires the central bank to hold the line on aggregate demand even in the face of leopardship in the aggregate supply curve that causes a recession. The question is, how much will fighting inflation cost the economy in terms of lost output? According to the pre-Lucas ASAD, or aggregate supply aggregate demand model, about 4% per year per each 1% shave from inflation. The new classical macroeconomic model, by contrast, is much more optimistic. If the public knows and believes that central bank will fight inflation, output won't fall at all because both the AD and the AS curves will stay put. Workers won't fight for higher wages because they expect market price will stay the same. An anticipated anti-inflation stance, by contrast, will cause a recession. The moral of the story told by the neoclassical macroeconomic model appears to be that the central bank should be very transparent about fighting inflation, but opaque about EMP. The new Keynesian model also concludes that an anticipated and anti-inflation policy is worse than an anticipated and credible one, though it suggests that some drop in output should be expected due to stickiness. A possible solution to that problem is to slowly ease money supply growth rather than slamming the brakes on. If the slowing is expected and credible, in other words, if economic agents know the slowing is coming and fully expect it to continue until inflation is history, the AS curve can be the sticky build to some degree. Maybe contracts indexed to inflation will expire and not be renewed. New contracts will build in no or at least lower inflation expectations, or perhaps contracts for materials or labor will become shorter term. If that is the case, when money supply growth finally stops, something akin to the unsticky word of the new classical macroeconomic model will hold. The AS curve won't shift much, if at all, and inflation will cease without a major drop in output. How can central bankers increase their credibility? One way is to make their central banks more independent. Another is not to repeatedly announce A but do B. A third is to induce the government to decrease or eliminate budget deficits. Figure 26.3, the three major macro models compared, summarizes the differences between the pre-Lucas aggregate supply aggregate demand model, the new classical macroeconomic model, and the new Keynesian model. Stop and think box. In Bolivia, in the first half of 1985, prices rose by 20,000%. Within 1 month, inflation was almost eliminated at the loss of only 5% of gross domestic product. How did the Bolivians manage that? Which theory does the Bolivian case support? A new Bolivian government came in and announced that it would end inflation. It made the announcement credible by reducing the government's deficit, the main driver of money's expansion, in a very credible way, balancing its budget every single day. This instance, which is not atypical of countries that end hyperinflation, supports the two rational expectation-based models over the pre-Lucas ASAD model, which predicts 4% losses in GDP for every 1% decrease in the inflation rate. The fact that the output did decline somewhat may mean that the policy was not credible at first, or it may mean that the new Keynesian model has it right and the AS curve was a little bit sticky. Key takeaways. Whether policymakers can improve short-term macroeconomic performance depends on the degree of wage and price stickiness, that is, how much more realistic the new Keynesian model is than the new classical macroeconomic model. If the latter is correct, any attempts at EMP and EFP that are anticipated by economic actors will fail to raise output, and in fact, can reduce output if the stimulus is less than the public expected. The only hope is to implement unanticipated policies, but that is difficult to do because central bankers can never be absolutely sure what expectations are at the time of policy implementations. On the other hand, inflation can be squelched relatively easily by simply announcing the policy and taking steps to ensure its credibility. If the new Keynesian model is correct, output can be increased over YNRL in the short term only, of course, because, regardless of expectations, wages and prices cannot rise due to multi-year contractual commitments like labor union contracts and other sources of stickiness. Inflation can also be successfully fought by announcing a credible policy, but due to wage and price stickiness, it will take a little time to take hold and output will dip below YNRL, though by much less than the pre-Lucas ASAD model predicts.